Week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season is here, so you know exactly what we're going to do. Before you guys set your final lineups for the week, we're going to break down 10 things you need to know before week 10 of 2024 fantasy football. Okay, let's kick the video off with a must-start player of the week. We've been talking about this throughout the entire course of the week here on the channel. Tyrone Tracy in the early morning game today, going up against the Carolina Panthers, still giving up the most fantasy points to the running back position thus far on the season. This is a defensive unit that we have been starting running backs against all season long, and that is not going to stop here in week 10. Tyrone Tracy coming off of a game where he had just 7.9 fantasy points, 16 touches, 66 rushing yards, and 4.13 yards per carry, as well as one catch for 3 receiving yards. I know that was a disappointing stat line against the Washington Commanders in week 9, but this Commanders defensive unit has been playing better as of late, and the game script was just not there for Tyrone Tracy or the Giants to run the football. So here in week 10, in this overseas games in Germany, we're going to see a different type of game script. I think both running backs, Chuba Hubbard and Tyrone Tracy, for both the Panthers and the Giants are set for big days. But if you're looking at this past week, looking at what Tyrone Tracy gave you in week 9, ignore it. He is a must-start player in a smash matchup here in week 10. Do not leave Tyrone Tracy on your bench. One more time, I am doubling down on my confidence in Tyrone Tracy here in week 10. I'm heading straight to Underdog to take the over on Tracy to score a rushing or receiving touchdown here in week 10. All new users on Underdog are getting a free NFL Pick Em when you sign up with promo code The Catch. That link is down below. So all you need to do is take your free Pick Em, pair it with Tracy to score a rushing touchdown. Once both those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. On top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code The Catch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So here's an easy way to get a big win right off the bat on Underdog and get up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Just use that promo code The Catch when you guys sign up on Underdog. That link is down below. All right, next thing that you need to know that you probably already know is that Christian McCaffrey is back. It took us 9 full weeks. We're in week 10, and we're going to see Christian McCaffrey play, going up against a Tampa Bay Buccaneers unit that is allowing the 24th most fantasy points to the running back position. I am definitely starting Christian McCaffrey if I own him this week. Now, a lot of you guys out there are going to look at this and feel a little bit of risk coming on here, but it's Christian McCaffrey. I mean, if you have traded for Christian McCaffrey, if you've been holding on to Christian McCaffrey all season long, this is what you're waiting for. And generally speaking, I do agree with the sentiment that I don't like starting a player in their first game back from injury or major injury. But if it's Christian McCaffrey, I feel a little bit different. Plus, Kyle Shanahan has already come out and said, Jordan Mason, Isaac Garando, what are their roles going to be? I mean, he literally said their roles are primarily going to be in the special teams department. I mean, the Niners are going to utilize Christian McCaffrey. How could they not, right? Don't forget, this is your RB1 last year in fantasy football by a mile. 391 total fantasy points, 24.5 fantasy points per game. Jordan Mason also just taken off the injury list as he was still dealing with that shoulder injury. So there's that as well. And don't get me wrong, I've talked about this throughout the course of the season. I think we will see some touches to Jordan Mason, potentially Isaac Garando, regardless of what Kyle Shanahan said. But at the end of the day, the majority of the volume is going to Christian McCaffrey, and I'm expecting a good game script here. Both these defenses bending as of late, especially the Buccaneers. 2 good offensive units here, even though the Bucs are banged up, but this is a home game for the Buccaneers. So the Niners coming out of their bye week, they're going to have a good game plan put together here. And Christian McCaffrey is going to be a big part of it. So if you own Christian McCaffrey, fire him up going into week 10. Of course, it depends on who else is on your roster, I guess. But like I said, If you own Christian McCaffrey, this is what we're waiting for. If I own him, I'm throwing him into my starting lineups. No questions asked here in week 10. Next thing that you need to know is that Jameson Williams is going to be back this week as well after serving a 2-game suspension. He's now reinstated. He's no longer suspended. He's going to be back in week 10. Jameson Williams was dropped in leagues, was like traded, thrown to the curb. Might be available in your league if you're lucky, but he has moved up to 83% rostered. And I think Jameson Williams is a very strong flex play going into the week. So especially with the 4 bye weeks this week, injuries still rampant across the league. If you're in need of a high upside flex play for the week, I like Jameson Williams against the Houston Texans quite a bit going into week 10. This is a road game for the Lions, so there's that, but this is going to be a good primetime matchup. Sunday Night Football, Texans, Lions, 2 very good teams in the NFL. The Texans barely keeping hold of the top of their division with 3 losses, and the Lions, of course, the top of their division, which is also, of course, a very competitive division. But overall, this is what we want, right? Good game script, 2 good teams, Sunday Night Football, all of that stuff. And in this matchup, 2 secondaries that have struggled against the wide receiver position when it comes to fantasy points scored. We talked about the Texans last week. We talked about Garrett Wilson as a must-start player going into Thursday Night Football. We saw a double-digit fantasy performance from Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams. I think that is definitely feasible for both Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams here in week 10. Just don't forget, I've said it throughout the week, going into week 6, Jameson Williams was the wide receiver 15 in fantasy football. I know he gave us that dud performance in week 7 and then got suspended for 2 games. I know the volume wasn't very good his past few games, but overall, the upside has been there. 14.4 or more fantasy points in 4 out of his 6 starts so far on the season, 12.4 fantasy points per game. Plenty of upside. Sure, it's a little bit risky, but I love this matchup. This Texan secondary has just been completely awful so far on the season. So if you own Jameson Williams, you want some upside going into the week, I think he is a strong flex option here in week 10. And next thing that you need to know is that Chris Olave is headed to IR. Not going to be playing in week 10 like we all knew, but overall, this Saints roster, it is depleted. What does that mean going into the week? Well, yeah, you're going to start Alvin Kamara, duh. And outside of that, who are you going to start on this roster? Taysom Hill, of course, going up against the Atlanta Falcons, a unit allowing the 19th most fantasy points to the tight end position thus far on the season. Taysom Hill is going to be utilized in the backfield. He's going to get the ball thrown to him. He's going to be utilized in the way that Taysom Hill is utilized on a regular basis. So we go back to week 4, 14.4 fantasy points for Taysom Hill in that matchup against the Falcons. Here we are in week 10 against the Falcons. I will not be surprised if we get another double-digit performance out of Taysom Hill this week. Obviously, last week going up against the Carolina Panthers, a unit allowing the most fantasy points to the tight end position so far in the season, was not surprising to see him get 16 total fantasy points. But overall, this past week, he had 4 catches for 41 receiving yards, then 5 total carries for 19 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. So I will not be surprised if we get a similar stat line out of Taysom Hill here in week 10. So if you're hurting at the tight end position, he sits at 47% rostered. We've talked about this on the channel over the past couple of days. Taysom Hill should be a strong start going into the week. Don't forget, we've got other running backs on this team like Kendre Miller and Jameson Williams banged up. We've got other wide receivers on this team banged up as well. I mean, it's just a mess here for the Saints. So don't get me wrong. I don't know exactly what to expect out of the Saints offense today, but overall, I would expect plenty of overall volume to Taysom Hill. Hurting at the tight end position, and Taysom Hill is sitting out there on the waiver wire. Adam, start him. If he's sitting on your bench, you're going to want to strongly consider starting him here in week 10. All right, the next thing that you need to know is that Devonta Smith is off of the injury report, as is A.J. Brown. And we're going into week 10 on the road here for the Eagles against a Dallas Cowboys secondary, allowing the 21st most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So at this point in time, I am firing up both Philadelphia Eagles wide receivers if I own them, as I always am. But I've got a lot of questions throughout the week, seen a lot of rosters that include Devonta Smith. A lot of you guys a little bit nervous to start him this week. There's no reason to be nervous to start Devonta Smith. He's healthy. He's good to go. He's off the injury report. He's a top 20 fantasy football wide receiver on the season. I know he had the goose egg game in week 7, but like I told you guys in the buy low video in week 8, Devonta Smith does that. I don't know what it is, but he has that bad game once a season. Outside of that, 14.9 or more fantasy points in every game on the season that he's played in so far on the season. 3 touchdowns and 4 of the last starts. Devonta Smith has been great. If you own him, don't overthink it. I think that the Eagles could come in to Dallas here in week 10 and make a huge statement in terms of their place in this division. This Cowboys unit just in a complete shambles. Dak Prescott headed to season-ending IR. CeeDee Lamb is going to play. We'll talk about that in a bit. But overall, this Cowboys team just not in a good place. The Eagles have a chance to come out and make a very strong statement offensively and defensively. I think we're going to see that. So if you own A.J. Brown, don't be worried about whatever happened with his knee this past week. He's good to go. If you own Devonta Smith, don't be worried here. The hamstring injury, not going to be a factor. He's going to be good to go. And Dallas Goedert also cleared to go here in week 10. He has not played since week 6, where he only saw 1 total target and 5% of snaps. So basically hasn't played since week 4. He's dropped to 77% roster. Needs some help at tight end. He's definitely worth picking up. We could see some overall volume to Dallas Goedert. But overall, the injury report looks very good for the Eagles, and I think they have a good chance at coming out and basically dominating the Cowboys here in week 10. The next thing that you need to know is that Deebo Samuel is still questionable going into week 10 at the time that I'm recording this. So what does that mean for the rest of this unit? Well, I think Jauan Jennings, sitting at 66% rostered, could be in line for a very good fantasy outing. And really, I like Jennings as a strong flex option here in week 10. If Deebo Samuel plays or doesn't play him, arguably I might like him more if Deebo does play. But that's just because there should be less defensive pressure on Jauan Jennings. Overall, Jennings is going into this matchup as a strong start. We haven't really seen Jennings play since week 6, right? I mean, we had the bye week in week 9. He had the hip injury right before the bye week, missed those matchups against Kansas City and Dallas. But this is Jennings' first game where we're going to see no Brandon Ayuk on the field. Going to see what happens with Deebo as time progresses from the time I record this to the time this video comes out early Sunday morning. So we'll see what happens. But if you own Jennings, you're kind of in a position where you're not super confident in one of your flex options. I think Jennings should be a solid start here in week 10. We talked about this matchup earlier in the video with Christian McCaffrey. I'm expecting a good game script here. I'm expecting points. Tampa Bay Buccaneers allowing the 25th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Their defense has really not been good the past couple weeks. And Niners defense is fine, but they're certainly not the best in the league, like, last year or anything like that, or one of the best in terms of last year, right? But overall, I'm expecting points scored in this game, a good game script. As a side note, I really like Brock Purdy in this matchup as well, as the Bucs are allowing the 31st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But moral of the story is, if you own any Niners players today, I think you should be throwing them in your starting lineup. And for the most part, I actually like most of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offensive starters as well. But Jennings sitting at a lower roster percentage at 66% rostered, and definitely could be a player who's sitting on your bench. If you want a strong flex option, I think Jennings is that guy here in week 10. Move along to the fact that Sam Darnold has a fantastic matchup. And by fantastic, I mean literally the best matchup you could potentially ask for, going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, allowing the 32nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So allowing the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks thus far on the season. And, I've got a lot of questions about the quarterback position throughout the week. And I absolutely love Sam Darnold going into week 10. And, he's had 17 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts. He's had 17 or more fantasy points in every game since week 2, except for week 5 against the Jets, which was an awful performance at 5.2 points. And regardless, I mean, we can scrap that, right? He's been fantastic on the season. 17 or more fantasy points in every game on the year except for weeks 1 and week 5. So I think Darnold is a very safe start this week going up against this Jaguars defense that's arguably the worst all-around defense in the entire NFL. He's got a super safe floor and a very good ceiling this week as well. And as a matter of fact, while I definitely think Sam Darnold is a must-start quarterback going into the week, I think Jordan Addison is a very sneaky, high upside flex option. As the Jaguars have obviously struggled against the wide receiver position, you're going to start Justin Jefferson. We don't need to break that down. And earlier in the week, we talked about Aaron Jones as a must-start running back going into week 10 as well. I mean, we want to start all of the Vikings skill position players because that's how bad this Jaguars defense is. That includes TJ Hawkinson at the tight end position, as the Jaguars have allowed the 29th most fantasy points to the tight end position so far on the season. We have talked about starting tight ends against the Jaguars literally almost all season long. This is one of the teams that we look at. Who is playing the Jaguars? Who is their starting tight end? Because they just really, really struggle against guarding tight ends. They love to give up touchdowns to opposing tight ends. So TJ Hawkinson, who I told you guys I don't want to start him in week 9 in his first game back to action. 4 targets, 3 catches, 27 receiving yards, 5.7 fantasy points. But that's what you expect from a player coming back from the type of injury that Hawkinson had after missing the first 8 games on the season. I think in week 10, he gets it going here against his Jags team. Now, there's definitely a world here where there's a lot of mouths to feed now with Addison, fully healthy, Hawkinson fully healthy, Aaron Jones doing his thing, JJ being JJ. I don't know how competitive the Jaguars are going to be able to keep this game the way that the Vikings defense looks. So bear that in mind, but it's worth the risk to start all these skill position guys. And I think Hawkinson could see a huge jump in fantasy points from what we saw in week 9 to what we're going to see here in week 10 against the Jaguars. So if you own Hawkinson, you don't feel like you have much better at the tight end position, or you just want some upside going into the week, because maybe you play Chase Brown or Jamar Chase or Joe Burrow or Lamar Jackson or anyone in that game, basically, except for Zay Flowers. But regardless, if you want some upside, he's got a great matchup. So if you owned Hawkinson, this is the week I think you can roll him out there. We've been waiting for it. Let's do it. Basically, you could head over to Underdog and take any of the lines for any Vikings players this week, but I love Sam Darnold's passing touchdowns line sitting at 1.5. I would be sprinting to Underdog to take the over on Darnold to throw for more than 1 touchdown here in week 10. He has done that in each of his last 2 matchups against the Colts and the Rams, and I think he will absolutely smash this against the Jaguars. So like I said earlier in the video, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch are getting a free NFL Pick Em for the week. Take your free Pick Em, take Darnold over on passing touchdowns. Once both of those hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up with promo code TheCatch, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, the next thing that you need to know is that, Dak Prescott is going to have season-ending surgery, and CeeDee Lamb, on the other hand, is off of the injury report as he's been dealing with that shoulder injury he suffered in week 9. So I know a lot of you guys are going to kind of look at your lineup and say, maybe I'm going to pass on CeeDee Lamb because the Eagles defense has looked fantastic, and don't get me wrong, they surely have. They've moved up to 15th against the wide receiver position so far on the season. We got Cooper Rush as a starting quarterback here, but I want you guys to keep something in mind here. A, you should still start CeeDee Lamb. B, let's go back to 2022 when Dak Prescott missed a couple weeks to start the season. And let's look at what CeeDee Lamb did in those games with Cooper Rush at the starting quarterback position. Weeks 1 through 6 on that season, week 1 was not good against Tampa Bay. Kind of a weird game, 11 targets, just 2 catches. But every other game with Cooper Rush as a starting quarterback, double-digit fantasy performances for CeeDee Lamb with 10.3 or more fantasy points in all of those games, 15.1 and 3 of the 15.1 or more, in 3 of those games with a ceiling of 22.7 fantasy points. CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver 5 in that season as well. So, yeah, Cooper Rush, sure, maybe the upside you could argue is capped here. I mean, it's different than having a healthy Dak Prescott starting here, but I think it's good enough. I really do think it's good enough for CeeDee Lamb to still be a viable option as a starter in fantasy. I don't think there's any reason to bench CeeDee Lamb this week, okay? I could get it early in the week, feeling a little bit nervous, like, where does CeeDee Lamb's health stand? We got Cooper Rush starting. The Eagles have looked good, all that stuff. But CeeDee Lamb is still averaging 18.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He only has one single-digit performance in Week 3 against Baltimore. He's a wide receiver 5 so far on the season. If you own CeeDee Lamb, don't overthink this, guys. He is still a strong start on a week-in, week-out basis, and he's still going to be the heartbeat of the Cowboys offense. So if you own CeeDee Lamb, don't bench him here in Week 10. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about Tyreek Hill, who is now listed as questionable going in to Monday Night Football. Literally the worst thing we could possibly ask for. A star player, I know he hasn't quite been a true star player this year, but a star player listed as questionable going into Monday Night Football. That's just going to cause a huge headache for your starting lineup here in Week 10. So what do? I mean, you probably have to hold out here. It's a great matchup as the Rams have given up the 26th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position thus far on the season. And since we've had Tua back in action, we've seen 2 double-digit performances for Tyreek Hill in the past 2 weeks. I know the ceiling hasn't been high, but 12 or more fantasy points in the past 2 weeks. So, you know, this is really tough here because if you get to Monday night and Tyreek Hill ends up not playing, well, then what are you going to do? I mean, maybe Demarcus Robinson is out there. That's like the only scenario that I think is okay here. But even then, like, it's not a great matchup for the Rams wide receivers as this Miami pass defense has been very good. So, you know, what are you going to do? What type of option do you have? You're only left with Dolphins or Rams players available at the wide receiver position or flex spot. So maybe if you're able to move Hill to the flex spot, you can roll with an additional running back. It's just one of those situations that we hate as fantasy managers. So just make sure if you are a Tyreek Hill owner, you're looking at your lineup going into today, make sure that you've moved Tyreek Hill to the flex spot out of that wide receiver spot so you have a little bit more flexibility if he ends up not playing. Now, this could be a nothing burger. Hill could be completely good to go. I mean, he has these injuries pop up all the time, but Mike McDaniel didn't really give us a promising statement basically saying that we'll see, and if Hill's body allows him to play, then he'll play. But that could also just be coach speak trying to, you know, confuse Sean McVay and the Rams and their game plan defensively, all that stuff. So we'll see what happens here, but it's definitely a situation that we need to monitor closely and something that if you own Tyreek Hill, that you need to pay attention to in terms of how you're setting your lineup going into Week 10. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 10 things you need to know before Week 10 of 2024 fantasy football. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 10, make sure to drop me a comment. I will do my very best to get every single comment on this video answered before Sunday's games kick off. May not get everything answered before the Panthers-Giants game, but I'll try my best to get everything answered before the afternoon slate of games, as always. And don't forget, guys, we have everything that you could possibly need on a weekly basis here on the channel to help you guys dominate fantasy football on a week-in, week-out basis. So most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say good luck to everybody here in Week 10. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.